Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Women for Kansas virtual chapter meeting. And we're really excited to have Senator Titus here today with us. And hopefully everybody's staying nice and warm on our first real fall day here. Well, first we're going to start out, and we have Susan Osborne with us, who is our co-leader for the chapter. And I can't remember if I said I'm the other co-leader, Pam Martin, and also the leader for Barton County chapter. So with that, I wanted to just give you a little bit for those of you that may not know about Women for Kansas. We are a nonpartisan organization, and we advocate for moderate legislative policies. And we recruit, motivate, and educate women in all Kansans to actively participate in the process of electing moderates to public office. And as I said, advocate for policies. Some of our legislative priorities are a fair and progressive tax system that adequately funds public services, a court system free from political influence, equal rights for all, reproductive rights and bodily autonomy, separation of church and state, advocacy of health care as a human right, stronger laws to prevent gun violence, preservation of excellence in our public schools and higher education, recognition of and support for the arts as vital to our quality of life, protection of our environment and ecosystems against avoidable degradation. And that's one of the reasons why we're here today, of course, is about our most vital resource, which is water. Can't go very far without clean water, can we? Clean, fresh water. Let's see. As far as announcements, we'll be gearing down for December. We won't have a December meeting. We'll start back up in January, and we'll get that out to you. We already have ideas for speakers lined up. Let's see.
Can I mention that
Yes.
we have chapters all over the state. So if you want more information about Women for Kansas, go to spelled out Women for Kansas dot, is it org or com? Org. I do this so much. And also sign up for our newsletters, which are weekly. And also want to tell you, if you have a question during this presentation, enter your question into chat and we'll make sure your questions are addressed.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, well, I think without further ado, we're going to get started here. And we're, like I said, so excited to have Senator Titus here and taking this Sunday afternoon off. He represents the 18th Senate District, which is Pottawatomie, Shawnee, and Jefferson counties. And he was first elected to the House of Representatives in 2022, to the Senate in 2024. He serves on agriculture, local government, and commerce committees. And he's vice chair of the Judiciary Committee and co-chair, as we know, of the Water Program Task Force. And prior to his election, he served as a state attorney for the Kansas Department of Transportation, and he has a lot of experience in water law. He represented the Kansas Water Office in the Attorney General's office, the Kansas Department of Agriculture, where he represented the Division of Water Resources, and he was involved in a number of water-related issues. He currently works as an attorney for Foley Equipment Company, lives in Wamego with his wife, Kara, and sons, Jonah and Samuel. And we found out that he's from Great Bend, so that's a plus too. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Senator Titus, and thanks again.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of this background and some of the work. So one of the things I did that wasn't on there while I was working at DWR, I was also an adjunct professor at KU Law School, and I taught water law. So when we have a group like this and there's some time to go through stuff, I pull out a lot of my basic, this is why the way water is in Kansas, And so I'll kind of walk you through that and give you the landscape of how it developed over the years. And then I'll finish up with kind of a summary. This is what we've done in the last couple of years in the legislature. This is what the Water Task Force is working on, and we'll go from there. So I don't know if probably easiest to manage questions at the end, but put them in if you want to put them in as you think about them, and we can work through them from there. So I like to start with this picture here, and if you can't read the text, it's a little postcard picture, but it's irrigating winter wheat on a ranch 6 miles west of Dodge City, Kansas, January 30th, 1911. And I love these old pictures, one, because I would never go out to a field in January wearing a tie and my suit jacket and everything else. So, bless them for doing that. But, you couldn't do this anymore today, right? This is sort of the picture of how much the world has changed, because once you get east of Garden City all the way till, somewhere in between Larned and Great Bend, you're not going to have any water in the Ark River. So you could never break off a canal like that, let alone let it run through in January. So it just gives you an idea of how far we've come in 115 years. So this is sort of, let's walk through. There are really two ways we use water in the United States, and it's because of geography. So the United States it's humid in the east. It has rainfall, lots of surface water, lakes, rivers, swamps, things like that. Of course, the western half, with the exception of kind of the Pacific Northwest, is very arid. You can see the annual precipitation, and that map gets drawn. That 100th meridian is really kind of the big line. So you'll see that the 100th meridian is where the Bureau of Reclamation has jurisdiction in the it's the 98th and west. And the Bureau of Reclamation's job is to reclaim what was seen as wasteland or deserts and put it to use. That's why you have the big dams and reservoirs and irrigation canals in the west, because we're reclaiming that land. And when they put that law in place, the idea was to settle the west. And they didn't need that in the east because it was easier to develop. And you see Kansas and the other plain states straddle these lines between humid in the east and arid in the west, and that really leads to a lot of our challenges as we look through the future. There are a couple different ways water's sort of managed and legally dealt with in the United States. East of Kansas, every state uses what's called riparian water law. It's developed over the years. It was originally based mostly on kind of like our legal system. It was decisions in court cases. Most of it's been put into state statutes now, but this is essentially the law that was used in England. And the idea is there's enough water almost every year for everybody to get what they need. So their laws are based on everybody gets their fair share. And when we have a drought year and not enough water, then we'll all split it the best we can, because this is a short-term problem. And next year we'll have plenty of water, or in 2 years. Every state from Kansas west has adopted what we call prior appropriation. And this is first in time, first in right. So whoever puts the water to use first and gets their water right, most states have a number system, right? So the lower your number in Kansas, the more senior your water right. So that means when there's not enough water, we're going to fulfill water right number 1 first, and then water right number 2 gets its full share, and so on until we run out of water. And if we run out of water, say at number 10, everyone after number 10, you don't get water that year. But the reason that was put in place is because it's the opposite of the eastern United States. In the West, most years, there isn't enough water for everyone to use. In really good years, right, maybe 1 out of 5 years, there is enough water for everybody. But in the driest years or normal years, there isn't enough to share. Water law is primarily a creature of state law. There are some federal areas of overlap, such as interstate compacts, things like that. But every state has it done a little bit differently. Some states manage groundwater and surface water the same. In some states, those are 2 different legal systems. You'll find, in states that were owned by Spain, New Mexico especially, but in Texas as well, there are water claims that go back to grants from the Spanish crown. The Pueblo Indians have a unique system of how they share water in their communities. And all of this has to be worked into state law. In Kansas, We have 4 tribal reservations that all existed before the state came into existence, and they all have water rights that in our state system predate the oldest water right the state of Kansas granted. Hawaii has its own unique native system as well. So it varies greatly from state to state, and you see that with that precipitation map. So one of the basic questions, though, is why do we have water law? Why did it come into place, right? Why didn't the neighbors just figure out how to share these resources and solve things? And this is the main reasons why. So you're thinking primarily 19th century United States as we really began to develop and industrialization began to take place. The primary purposes was to encourage economic development. And you think about the very first uses in California, right? The 49ers, the gold rush, mining is the first thing that's going to happen in the West. And, you think of those old Westerns with the mining films, and there you've got the pans, I don't have my terminology, but they shake out the dirt and the gold, and it takes a lot of water to mine those natural resources. And so that's where you put the water to use first. Well, as the mining camps and towns develop, say, well, we have to feed these people and supply these people, right? And then it goes from mining, and then irrigation becomes the second use. And you want to take arid land, think of the plains of western Kansas. We're going to put irrigation on that land so that we can grow crops every year, because without irrigation, it's too dry here to grow the things we're used to growing. So it's this idea, it's an essential resource. We're going to ration it. Water is a little unique in the government element. We protect it as sort of a public right because we recognize how important water is. It's important for health reasons, right? You can't live without water, but the economic benefit. And so you end up with this system where you have private rights to use the water attached to your property, but you also have sort of this overall regulation. Now, I compare that to things like minerals and oil and gas, where they're mostly just private rights, because in some ways, water law is kind of similar, and in some states, to their detriment, I think they've made water like oil and gas. But in most states, we're going to have that public piece that overlays the use of water, because we know we have to protect it. But the two main reasons water law develops is we have a preference for economic development, and it turns into subsidizing irrigation. And one thing you see as a common strain as you read through the old cases is creating water laws creates stability. And people that invest money and people that develop communities, if they can't count on things being stable and dependable, especially with something like water, then it's impossible to bring economic development to these areas, because you don't know if your investment will just, go up poof in a cloud of dust. So that's how water law started. Now, I like to show this picture because John Wesley Powell, who was one of the first, I believe, directors of the Bureau of Reclamation at one point, and also the Geological Survey, he did a big tour of the West. He's upper left there. I think that's just a neat picture, but he had the idea on this map at the right that when we make Western states, he had suggested that the Western states, their state boundaries should match river basins. And if we had followed his advice, our Western states would look something like that map on the right. Because we didn't follow his advice, we spent 100 years in litigation on the Kansas-Colorado Ark River Compact, to give you one example, right? Because rivers cross states in ways that don't follow political boundaries, and we have to find ways to split up that water. The political solution is interstate compacts, but we could have avoided a lot of those fights over which state has the right to water and which users have the right to water. But he was very forward thinking in his water sense there. So, irrigation, mining, we obviously use water for a lot more. And the way we want to use water in Kansas and every other state, that's changed over time. I tend to focus from here on out on the Western states, because that's where Kansas falls in. But if you think about the big cities in the West, post World War II migration has changed the shape of the West. If you think of life before air conditioning, there's a reason there weren't that many people in Phoenix in the 1920s, right? Even a city like Denver has grown dramatically. Las Vegas, Salt Lake City. These are places where it was harder to live before we had things like air conditioning. So population movement to the west has dramatically shifted who needs water. It's not just miners and farmers. It's now large metropolitan areas with complex economies that are calling for water. We're using more water because we got better at irrigating and growing crops. Before World War II, we didn't have center pivots. That was a game changer from Kansas all the way to California. The federal farm policy has had a tremendous impact on how we grow crops. We could have a whole debate whether we're incentivizing the right things and whether it makes sense for the future, because we think we're kind of locked in this cycle of we pay for maximum irrigation of crops, and if you refuse to do that, then you can't get crop insurance, and the cycle goes on. And some of you involved in farming personally, I think, will probably have a feel for that. But we've sort of created this system, and now we can't break out of it. Aquifers are non-renewable. They become depleted. That causes us to look at other supplies. Water pollution has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. I think at a point now, this looks better, but there was a point in time we were losing resources before the Clean Water Act to usable water. And just as a society, we prioritize wildlife and recreation much more. When most states' first water laws went into place, there was no consideration for recreation, maybe a very small amount for wildlife if you're thinking of, subsistence fishing, things like that. But, we now have the laws created in-stream water rights to protect wildlife and recreation. These were novel things. States had to litigate whether it was even allowable under their constitution to create these sort of water rights. So as a society, we're looking at water differently than that purely economic development base that it started on. So these are sort of some basic slides about water permitting in Kansas. Why do you need a water right? So water is a property right in Kansas, and I think the technical legal term is usufruct property right. So it's you have the right to withdraw a certain amount of water from your property and put it to use in a certain place. Water is protected for the use and benefit of the citizens of the state in the order of priority. So that's our basic prior appropriation citizen. So in theory, the water all belongs to us, and then it's given to individuals, and then that's how they develop a property right. We do this through the Division of Water Resources, which is in the Department of Agriculture. They have a chief engineer who's the chief when it comes to water quantity. He's the chief regulator of that in the state. He keeps all the records, regulates usage, issues penalties if people overpump or do something illegal. But the basic law in Kansas is it's illegal to use water without holding a permit or a water right, and you have to have that permission to move forward. With an exception, of course, at your house, your city owns a water right, and they're delivering you water, or your public water supply, your rural water district, whoever that may be. They have a water right that they're serving you under. There is, of course, an exception for domestic use. So that would be, if you live out of the country, you have a household, up to 2 acres of lawn and garden use, and any livestock that you may have on that 2 acres. You get to use that. I grew up in a house in the country. We had a well. Whenever that well was put in, you do actually have you have a water right priority to that, and it is protected from other uses. But we don't make people go, because if you actually get a water right number, you have to quantify it, and you have to file reports every year about how much water you use, and most people aren't interested in doing that on their home. But for example, if you ever buy a house in the country and they offer you the paperwork that shows when the well was put in, you should grab hold of that in case there's irrigation nearby. Because if you can prove your water right's older than the nearby irrigation, you can usually get Division of Water Resources to protect you. So there are some nuances like that, but the gist is every water right sort of fits into this big system. Every water right, and remember, keep in mind that idea that we want our water to be put to economic use, right? We want to grow the economy. That's the way the law is developed. So every water right has a beneficial use, and there's a whole list in regulation, but I've listed the main 4 there. Irrigation, and I'll show you some charts and let you see the breakdown, but irrigation, recreational, industrial, stock watering, right? These are some of our most common uses, and you have to lay that out in your application. Municipal, domestic, hydraulic dredging, thermal exchange. There's special water rights just for fire protection. All of this is laid out pretty clearly. You saw that map of the United States, precipitation ranges from east to west. Well, here is the up close picture of what that looks like in Kansas. So if you look way down in the right there, right, Baxter Springs and Cherokee County, they're getting 45 inches of rain a year. Where I live in Wamego and the Manhattan area, we're somewhere about 33 to 35 inches a year. And if you happen to be in that little corner between Ulysses and Johnson and Stanton County, you're getting somewhere between 0 and 16 inches. So, you know, there's probably some 6-inch years out there. This is why waterlogging gets complicated in Kansas, because what worked in Jefferson County or in Cherokee County works mostly in Rice and Barton County and not at all in Wichita and Greeley County. So it's hard to create a uniform system that applies equally across the state. And we struggled with that for a lot of years to try and figure out how to balance that. And some of the inequities we have and some of the issues we have stem from trying to make these systems work all together. But this is just kind of another representation of what I said. You know, precipitation ranges from 0 to 40 inches a year. And I think it's fairly straightforward, but eastern Kansas will rely primarily on surface water supplies. You have a number of reservoir and river systems in the east. So you think in the east, start where the Kansas River starts at Junction City, where the Republican and the Smoky Hill come together. You have Milford Reservoir, Tuttle Creek is on the Blue River into Manhattan. And then you have Perry Reservoir and Clinton. And all of those feed the Kansas River on into Kansas City. And I think that's our fastest growing population corridor. When you get far enough into Johnson County, you can draw off the Missouri River. But for Kansas, you know, if you think of our biggest growth corridor goes from Manhattan into Johnson County, most of that's going to draw their water off of the Kansas River. So keeping these reservoirs open is a big deal. Southeast Kansas has a number of smaller reservoirs that can dry up quickly, and they don't have a lot of groundwater down there. So they can be, for an area you think of, oh, well, they get 45 inches of rain a year, they should be fine. The problem is in a year where they get 25 inches, their reservoirs and their systems dry up fast, and they don't have alternate sources because there isn't plentiful groundwater there. And so maintaining those reservoirs is a big deal. Central Kansas, we get a mix. You have some surface water systems like Cheney Reservoir. You have wetlands, Cheyenne Bottoms, Quivira Wildlife Refuge. And then as you move west, it's almost entirely reliance on groundwater. You'll find even where there was surface water, we pumped so much groundwater. Those surface streams like the Ark River, for example, were originally fed by groundwater mostly. They would get mountain runoff that would come through the system, but they were primarily fed by groundwater. And we have detached that source of supply many years ago. So I always, there are still some groups of folks that will say, well, I wish Colorado wasn't keeping all that water so that we could have water in the Ark River at Dodge City. Well, the hydrological fact of that is we severed the water source to the Ark River in Dodge City many decades ago by pumping. Sure, there were floods that came through that far, but that wasn't going to get water past Dodge on into Kinsley in its natural state. When we look at groundwater, this is just kind of a snapshot of where our resources are. Of course, you're familiar with the High Plains Aquifer. We have a groundwater management districts over those areas. You'll see the outlines of the rivers. One area, you see the Kansas and its tributaries in the Ark. As water flows through those rivers, it'll seep down into the bed, and typically rivers are kind of carved out in a U shape. I don't have a good picture of that here, but you can put in a groundwater well. You'll notice, for those of you in Western Kansas, sort of the Pawnee Hodgman County branch there along the Pawnee River, right? You can have groundwater irrigation close to the stream, and there's enough water built up in there still that it has enough stream flow that it stays full enough you can irrigate crops. But you see, as I was saying, in Southeast Kansas, they have the verdigris and a couple decent sized river systems, but the alluviums are not really nearly as supportive of irrigation as some of the larger ones in the state. Of course, over time, we've had to close areas to new water rights. Many of these water rights were closed well after they were fully appropriated due to evolutions in state law over time. But all of the purple areas give you an idea of where you can't just go get a new water right anymore. So you see the groundwater management districts over the Ogallala right there. And then you can see some of the alluvium rivers where protections have been put in place because there's no availability of water there as well. Now, I point out, just because you see an area that is not purple and isn't officially closed as an area overall, that doesn't mean there's a water right necessarily available in any local area, right? Over time, there are now formulas that the Division of Water Resources will use when you do an application. They know about how much water is available without over appropriating an area, and they use a 2-mile circle calculation around where you want to put your well in, and they'll tell you, no, there's too many wells in here, not enough water available, and they can work through that now. So you would be unlikely to get a water right in an area where there isn't enough water to sustain the current levels, at least in current day. So one of the ways we try to manage water over the Ogallala is groundwater management districts were put in place in the early 70s. 2 and 5 are a little unique. They tend to have, they're close to balancing their water levels. A lot of that has to do, they get more precipitation than the 3 Western GMDs, but they also have sandier soils. And that means when it rains, the water recharges faster and is closer to the surface. And so they're sort of they have their own unique elements. And then the 3 Western ones, recharge is very slow. The water is very deep. It's drier. You have to use more water rights or for higher amounts. And so it's a little bit of a different scenario there. And the depth to water varies greatly. This is a little outdated, but it still mostly holds true. It just gives you a good comparison of who's using surface water and who's using groundwater. So you see in the eastern third of the state and up to north central, where we don't have that groundwater supply, you see in the red there, that's where people are using surface water irrigation rights. And then in the blue, right, as you move west, you sort of transition, and then that becomes almost solely groundwater. I'll probably give you the 2 biggest just sort of like things that might stand out. Way out west in Hamilton and Kearney County, you'll see some surface water. That is the canals that come off the Ark River from Colorado. And that Finney County also has a lot of groundwater, but they use a substantial amount. It doesn't feel like it on a percentage base, but they use a lot of surface water too. That's where the canals sort of stop. It's just west of Garden City. But that canal use is still prevalent out there and is one of the primary irrigation methods. In Barton County, the reason that is so high is because Cheyenne Bottoms has a very large senior water right for surface water. And Trego County, that would be the water right for Cedar Bluff Reservoir, and there's an irrigation district. I don't believe that's actively being used because of the circumstances there, but that's sort of where that comes from. Irrigation, Jewell County, Mitchell County, along the Solomon River Valley, and then there's water coming out of Nebraska from an irrigation district at Harlan County Reservoir as well. So just some of the nuances you see along the way there. I apologize, the quality of these pictures is not good, but you can see it by color. The map on the left, these are the points of diversion. So essentially, this is where the well is for surface water on the left, right? You see how it hugs all of the rivers and is in the alluviums, and you can see where those water rights are located specifically. And then the map to the right, of course, is our groundwater wells. So when they're prevalent, the dark area underneath is the Ogallala High Plains Aquifer, right? That area is covered with wells. And then you can see the outline of the Kansas River and the Republican River and a little bit of the Smoky and the Solomon where they were able to put in alluvial wells. So as far as total use, this, again, a little bit out of date, but still holds basically true. Of the water we use in Kansas every year, which, 4.3 million acre feet, this is 85% goes to irrigation. So we talk a lot about saving water in municipalities and stock water and industrial uses, but when you look at the big pie, it's going to irrigation. And a lot of that's groundwater in the western 2/3 of the state. And you can see the others, but municipal at 9% is pretty far behind irrigation. I talked a little bit about this, but in areas closed to new appropriations of water. So if you want a water right, I need water, I'm a new business, or I want to expand my farm or my feedlot or whatever, what do I do? So you can't get a new water right. So the way we manage that in our current economy is you have to go essentially buy a water right from somebody else and then change it to what you need. So, if an area is closed to new appropriations of water, you can convert or purchase an existing water right. There are some restrictions on that. So for example, you can't change the supply. So I can't buy a water right in Thomas County and then move that water right's point of diversion. I can't move that to Wallace County, right? Because that's clearly, I'm taking water from somewhere else. So you can move around a little bit, but it's a relatively small area within I forget it's maybe half a mile is about the most you can move one of these water rights to still say you're drawing from the same source of supply. If you're on a stream, it's a little bit easier. If you were pulling off surface water, you can measure that a little bit more clearly. But if you want to change it, so one of the most common things we see is if you have an expanding feedlot, what you'll do is you'll have to buy out an irrigation water right and then convert that to stock water. So you'll pull the water out there and pipe it to your feedlot or whatever, and you usually don't have to go too far to do that. But the other thing is, one of the principles of water law is called consumptive use. So you can't increase the amount of water that you actually consume. So when you put water on a field, for example, don't hold me to the percentages here, but something like 85% of the water is absorbed by whatever crop you're growing, or it evaporates on its own. And then about 15% actually seeps through the root system and will trickle back down to the groundwater source, right? Or cycle back into the river that it came out of. And so if you wanted to convert an irrigation water right into, say, a municipal water right or stock water, and we say, well, stock water uses, the consumptive use of that is 100% because the animal consumes 100% of the water you give it. There's nothing, for the most part, going back down into the system. The groundwater it got drawn out of. So if you have 100 acre feet and it's an irrigation water right and you want to turn it to stock water, we would only let you change your new stock water right. You could do that, but you would only be awarded 85 acre feet on the new use because we don't want to increase usage over time. And so that's how we protect existing systems and existing priority, is that we protect those amounts of use, and that should remain stable over time. So for example, the clearest example of this is the Bowersock Dam at Lawrence, and they run two power turbines off that. The consumptive use of that water is 0%. It has a huge water rate. It's like 120,000 acre feet a year, whatever runs through there. But I, as an irrigator, or the city of Lawrence, couldn't buy that right because 0% of that water is actually consumed. So it's useless for any other purpose because there's no consumptive use. And so you can't sort of trick the system about that. The other thing that became law in the mid-teens, most Western states have laws about abandonment. Again, this goes back to the economic basis for water rights initially. If you don't use your water for so many years in a row, then you abandon your water right, and someone else can come in and appropriate that water for an economic use. That made sense initially, right? When we want as much water as possible to be put to use for economic purposes. But as with groundwater that's non-renewable, we decided as a state that we were going to say, if you have a water right in a closed off area, we're no longer going to allow that water right to be abandoned. Because where you have declining water tables, people felt like they had to pump their entire allotment every year in order to protect from losing that water right. And we felt like there are some other things that are impacted by this. But the idea is we don't want people to pump water they don't need because they're afraid of losing their water right, because it's a non-renewable resource. And so I think that change has mostly been beneficial over time as well. But in many Western states, so Kansas never had something we call partial abandonment. In some states, if you have 100 acre feet and you pump 80 acre feet 5 years in a row, you could actually lose the 20 acre feet you're not using. Kansas was never that severe, but there are some incentives out there that don't necessarily make sense anymore. This is the primary measure we use to talk about water supplies in the West with groundwater, and it's the estimated usable lifetime. So basically, if you have less than 30 acre feet, that's when we say you've essentially exhausted your groundwater resource. Another measure I've seen is there's a certain amount of gallons per minute you can draw up to effectively irrigate. Once you drop below that, we consider it essentially exhausted. But like I talked about on those eastern GMDs, you see there from Harvey County through Stafford and the Big Bend area, they have some hot spots for sure, but you also see a lot of areas that are not declining because recharge is sufficient there. You see West Central Kansas, that's GMD 1. They had less depth originally, and they ran out faster. They've taken some good steps to cut back, but there are a lot of pockets where there isn't really good water left. Southwest Kansas, I could show you some other maps that look a lot worse than this. They had more water in deeper amounts, so there's still a lot of usable life left in these areas, but they've used a lot to get to this point. And Northwest Kansas, again, they've managed it better. The areas that are blue up there are very shallow areas, so they can be refilled, but there's not very much there. So it's very easy to drain those resources. So it kind of gives you a false idea that there's not declining, but there's also not very much use in those areas because it's not deep enough to really sustain large scale irrigation. So we have two major problems in water law. And this was really, there was under the Brownback administration, the water agencies did a 50-year vision of water in Kansas. Excuse me. And it really highlighted our two major problems: declining groundwater levels in the West. In the East, our major quantity problem is declining reservoir space. So sedimentation for the most part. Some reservoirs like Tuttle Creek Reservoir has 45% less capacity than it originally had because of sedimentation. So there's just less quantity available for storage to feed our major municipalities over time. So those are really the big things. We've looked at some solutions over time. We had the 50-year vision that I mentioned that really kind of strategically outlined all of our problems. There was a Blue Ribbon Task Force around 2018 that looked at some funding solutions. I need to update this slide. This was actually from the 2023 session, not last session's water bill. But there have been some efforts, and I'll talk about those recent bills here in a moment. Over time, we've put some tools in place in Kansas that are helpful. We have IGUCA's, intensive groundwater use control areas, LEMA's, local enhanced management areas. And IGUCA is an area where there are several of these in the state, including Walnut Creek in Barton County, Rush, and Ness County to protect Cheyenne bottoms. But the chief engineer comes in, holds hearings, decides how much water is available, and then he sort of, based on the evidence, sets allocations to restore balance in that water system. And those can be pretty drastic. And ultimately, the chief engineer decides how those cuts work. That made people uncomfortable with that process. So local enhanced management areas were created around 2012. Very similar in what they do, except that a local groundwater management district creates a plan. They send it to the chief engineer. He holds hearings. The chief engineer can reduce the restrictions, but he can't make them more severe than what the GMD sent him. And so those are sort of bottom-up plans, and those have been much more widely accepted, and it doesn't create sort of that political conflict of the state official coming in and turning off water. And so WCAs are voluntary reduction programs. Typically, what will happen in a water conservation area is you'll have a landowner with a lot of water rights. He would like flexibility in where he pumps water over maybe a 5-year period. So he'll come in, and usually your flexibility is tied to how much water you're willing to save. He'll agree to cut 20% of his use over, say, 10 water rights in a 5-year period, but he may be allowed in some years to overpump the amount, the appropriated amount on a certain water right in any given year, as long as he stays under that 80% number. So you give producers flexibility to save water overall. And that's kind of been the overall approach. Is producers seem to be willing to make larger cuts, provided they have more flexibility to manage what they're allowed to keep. And that's, a lot of states are too rigid. Kansas's law has evolved in a way where that works. A lot of states are just too rigid in their water laws to allow that. So I think that's one of our strengths over time. Two bills we passed my first year in the legislature when I was in the House of Representatives, and I worked pretty extensively on these in the Water Committee. The first was House Bill 2279, and it dealt with groundwater management districts. Some groundwater management districts have done an excellent job. GMD 4 in Northwest Kansas, they put the first LEMA in place around the Sheridan 6, so like the Hoxie area, and then they put in a GMD-wide LEMA shortly after that. I was actually involved in the litigation that found that to be a lawful LEMA, but other districts had done less or were unwilling to really support LEMAs or put forward serious plans. So the legislature decided it was time to sort of redirect focus in those areas. So we passed 2279. It required more reporting to the legislature about what the GMDs were doing. So they now submit annual reports to the legislature with their financials, things like that. And then the big thing, it required every district to identify the areas within their district that had less than 50 years of life left by July 1 of 2024. All districts complied with that. So we've identified these areas of concern. We then said, okay, now take 2 years, go talk to your people, and develop a plan to deal with these problems over the next 2 years. I believe the word we use is to reasonably address the declines, because we didn't want to be too heavy. And we're seeing the districts come around. And I will say I'm more optimistic than I've ever been about stabilizing water levels in Western Kansas. It's not going to happen overnight. But for example, the GMD3 in Southwest Kansas, who was essentially doing nothing to look at these reductions over the past 10 years, they've identified their areas. They've split them up. They have plans. They have the percentages. So there are some areas they're saying, hey, we can cut 8% in this area and stabilize it. We can do that next year. We have this other area, we need to cut 25%. That's a lot. But if we phase it in over 15 years, we can stabilize this area. And the fact that those conversations are even happening, I can't stress enough that there were no conversations like that 5 years ago. So it's huge. It represents huge progress. Now, we have to follow through to 2026 and actually get these plans submitted and approved. And there's a lot of work to be done, but those are heading in the right direction. Even the Eastern Kansas GMDs, we made water quality one of the components of this, and they're taking their water quality very seriously. GMD5 is looking at nitrate levels. They have leftover contamination from the 1920s oil fields in McPherson and Harvey County. Those districts are looking at water quality issues and what do they need to put in place to help with water quality. So this has been a really successful bill so far. There was a backstop. If they fail to act, we gave the chief engineer direct authority to come in and develop a plan for them. So it was very much a carrot and a stick approach. But again, I've been very, very proud of these guys and very grateful for how they've reacted. And I think we're making real progress. The next thing was House Bill 2302, state water plan funding. When it went into place, I believe it was 88 or 89. That was been about Mike Hayden. He put in $8 million a year that was supposed to be put into the water plan fund. They also There's also a fair amount of money collected from fees, like on livestock and municipalities. So it wasn't just the $8 million going into water projects. But we decided to go ahead and make a significant increase to funding. Part of that increase in funding was to dedicate some of that to municipalities. We put $34 million of new money into the water plan fund every year, which is more money than they've ever had to spend. And given the state that a lot of our municipalities are in with infrastructure and drinking water standards, we wanted to expand the focus of the water plan and bring some new entities in board to support this legislation. So we created a technical assistance grant program the water office runs, and then a project grant and loan forgiveness fund. And a lot of that money has been funneled to smaller communities to help them. So it also created some other funding flexibilities. We had leftover COVID money from various programs. We were able to require some debt on our existing federal reservoirs. So that was nice to get that out of the way. And so the idea here, this kind of led into the task force, which I'll talk about next. But this is sort of us dipping our toe into increasing funding and doing it. This program has a 5-year sunset. So it gives us 5 years to sort of evaluate the additional funding and look at how it's been spent. And that led us to House Bill 2172, which passed last year. This created the Water Program Task Force. I'm co-chair of that with Representative Jim Minix from Scott City. We have 13 members. It's fairly diverse membership. There were geographical requirements. There are some legislators, stakeholders from environment, municipal, industrial, et cetera. But 3 major objectives were given to us: evaluate the major risks to quality and quantity of the state's water supply and the economic impact those risks would have. We've mostly done that work. We need to identify steps the state must take to define and achieve a future supply of water, and then evaluate the current funding and determine if it's sufficient for future needs. We also put together a work group of professionals that includes attorneys, engineers, hydrologists, environmental scientists, to take an in-depth look at the state planning process and draft recommended legislation in conjunction with us. So as far as the task force, we held 2 meetings this summer. We had 2 online meetings to get things started. And then we held 2 meetings this summer in Dodge City. And those 4 meetings were pretty much dedicated to considering all the different risks to our water supply. A lot of this work has been done over the years, but we needed to get it all on the record and lay it all out. Of course, the 2 major problems do continue to exist, with declining groundwater levels in western Kansas and reservoir sedimentation in eastern Kansas. However, I do think it's a testament to the work of folks in the last decade that both those issues are pretty actively being addressed. I mentioned the bills that has the groundwater management districts actively looking at declines. They've done a good job with that, and we're making progress. We're experimenting with our reservoirs. There was a traditional dredging project at John Redmond about 10 years ago. That was not seen as a success. It was very expensive. I think it cost $7 or $8 million, or it was a very large number. And most of that is filled back in through natural sedimentation now. So that was not a success. However, Tuttle Creek, we're now experimenting with what's called water injection dredging. And the idea is to take these dredge boats and with giant water pumps, and they kick up sedimentation, put it, I forget the technical term, but they put the dirt back in the water and get it, it gets cloudy, and it flows out of the dam into the Blue River and on into Kansas. And so we help move that sedimentation naturally. That's been done in like river channels, but it's never been done in a confined inland area before for these purposes. And so they did their first trial run this fall. By everything I've seen, it's successful. I haven't seen an official report yet, but they'll do 2 more tests in spring and summer. But if that's successful, the amount of money it costs to do that is far lower per square foot of sedimentation we remove. Now, it doesn't work everywhere. There have to be gates to release water at the right level, and many of our reservoirs, the gates are too high. I believe this would Perry is the other reservoir where this would work, and I think there's one other where we could do this. But an alternative plan is to use the same dredging technology and use a hydrosuction tube to basically pull the water around the dam and put it in front of it or over the top or whatever they may do in a certain area. So we're working on a project like that. We've set aside some initial funding to do this at John Redmond. Again, we go back to John Redmond because it fills in fast, and it's the cooling source for the nuclear plant at Wolf Creek. So we like to keep the nuke safe. So, but we put some money aside there to help get that started. But those are federal reservoirs, so we have to negotiate with the Corps of Engineers. We've had good success with that, but if you think your state government is slow, I assure you your federal government will be slower almost every time. So we're hopefully getting that process going. So with those two things in mind, the third major problem that really sort of surfaced in our discussions was public water suppliers. I suspect wherever you live, you have some familiarity with this problem. I mean, there are downtowns with 100-year-old water pipes underneath them and old neighborhoods that deal with this. And it's just very expensive to make those repairs. Water quality is a problem. And it's getting tougher, right? You have nitrates in agricultural areas, PFAS or the forever chemicals. There are places in Kansas that have uranium problems. And the cost of, if you don't have a water treatment plant or yours is out of date, right? It's easily $5 to $10 million to build a treatment plant. Well, if you have a town of 800 people, that's a problem. Now the state's never going to be able to just pay for all those plants, but I see this as the primary issue. I think because we're making good progress in the other areas, we'll continue to support that. But I think this will sort of be the focus of our discussions is what do we do to help our public water suppliers? Things like regionalization. So if communities can combine water resources, we typically, and we need to be more proactive in that. There are some areas that are too far away, the geography just doesn't work, but typically communities don't want to give up any of their control. And so we don't even look at regionalization until it's an outright emergency. And we ignore solutions because folks don't talk to each other and they're siloed. So we have to look at things like that and then find ways to prioritize good projects. So we just met in November 3rd at Topeka, and we started to talk about our current process in Kansas. We had presentations from our water agencies talking about how they develop the water plan, how they make budget recommendations based on the water plan. And then on the 19th, what we'll do is get together and we'll hear presentations from Texas, Colorado, and California. And we'll hear the same information from them. How do you guys develop your water plans? How do you prioritize funding? And then our work group is going to do some work. And after the legislative session, hopefully we'll get together. And what we'll do is say, okay, we'll sit down with our working group and they're going to kind of say, we think this is the best system or this works best for Kansas, and updating our planning and funding process. And we'll have sort of a roundtable discussion with them and provide input and work on updating that process. Because our water planning process was started to be put in place in the late 60s, and it kind of got piecemeal put together over time. And we really need to look at, do we have our priorities in the right place? Does the current system really work for what we need? And if we do put a bunch more money into water, can this system responsibly and accountably handle that money? So I think that may be the biggest thing we bring out of this, is creating sort of the framework for all the work we need to do in the future. We're probably not going to solve all the problems, but if we come out with a bill that gets passed that modernizes our framework, I think that we've really accomplished something. So this presentation has actually gotten more optimistic over time with some of the progress we've made over the last couple of years. But I like to end on a note of optimism. So Mr. J.C. Hopper had this idea of a multi-state canal, and it was to move. This was pre-World War I. He wanted to move agricultural products right from the Western Plains down to the Red River and on to New Orleans for export. But I love the optimism. I don't know if you've been to Nest City, But this is what he thought Nest City might look like. And you see the Walnut River there. And you see the large boats and the dam, and anyone who's seen the Walnut River, I don't know if Mr. Hopner ever went to look at it before he drew this poster to sell his picture, but I appreciate the vision. You see some of the World War II, the World War I notes. This was from 1914, but irrigation, right? We should spend money on irrigation projects, not a standing army, right? You see some of those overtones there, but anyway, I like to end here and say we've had some big thinkers over the years, and you can see how important water's been over time. So that is my presentation. So I know I covered a lot of history. There's a lot going on now. Whatever questions you guys have, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you want me to go ahead, Susan?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of information I was not aware of. So that was great. Let's see. The first question that somebody had, and this goes way back to one of your first slides, but what is dewatering?
So you can get, when you're doing a construction project, if you're gonna, like, if you have to drain an area, like to maybe build down to a basement or something, you may have to pump water out of the ground so that you can actually do construction work. You're technically withdrawing water, and so there's a permit for dewatering.
Huh.
It would probably be a short term. I'd have to go look, but most of they're short term permits for temporary uses.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that. Let's see. And what issues do we have with water cleanliness, given agriculture has runoff issues? You kind of addressed that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern. The Clean Water Act deals with point source pollution rather, right? That's whether it's your municipal waste plant or your factory waste. That's if we know where it comes from. It kind of comes out of one pipe or one area. It's easy to regulate, right? Clean Water Act doesn't directly regulate what we call non-point source solution, which this is going to be most of your agricultural runoff. And it is a problem. Nitrates are the most obvious example, but there are other things in it, and it seeps into the groundwater, it moves, and communities in agricultural areas especially are having to deal with it. But if you're downstream of an old federal base or ammunition plant, PFAS are a real problem. That's seeped in the groundwater over time. So the problem is it's just hard. It's hard to regulate these things. The work it takes, like if you think of a reservoir watershed, you can't make everybody implement best practices all the way up the watershed. And so you have to do that slowly and intentionally, but and prioritize the right areas. But it's hard. It's hard to get it all that. Nebraska recently passed a bill, maybe 5 years ago. They require in their natural resource districts, farmers have to, if the nitrate levels are high in the water, they have to report how much nitrate they're putting on, and there are restrictions on use depending on the levels and the testing. So we got a presentation from them last week at the Water Task Force, and there seems to be an appetite to look at some of those things. And it may start out just as reporting, but I think folks are paying more attention. And really, one thing we have to decide, I would say that, dollars and cents, as much as I say our water priorities have changed, I think the economics of towns having to pay to treat water that doesn't meet standards may push agricultural change more than anything else, right or wrong. Once you start looking at those new treatment plants, I think that's probably where the pain, the pinch point is. So that's kind of a roundabout answer, but it is a real issue. But it's hard to get at directly. Is probably my best answer.
It's huge, as you know, here, and K-State and another university just did a study, and Stafford County, Barton County, high rates, Pawnee County, high rates of nitrates, and of course the people most impacted by that are pregnant women, fetuses and infants and young children. So I would think that that would become a priority. Because another issue is, as you were saying, that small municipalities, they don't have the funds to update their water systems. So, is that going to be, it sounds like that's going to be a part of what you're talking about, but are you looking at avenues of funding? I mean, you said regional type of things, but that's still going to take funding.
Yeah, there's definitely going to be a role for state funding. It's deciding sort of the scope and how do we prioritize projects, right? Does it, if you're in a town of 150 people with declining populations and a difficult and maybe your school's 30 miles away, you know, can the state invest in that, millions of dollars to fix a problem there? Is that appropriate use of state funds when we think about it overall? Those are the sort of things we have to wrestle with. What do we want to prioritize, and is there an economic tie-in to measure that? I think those are the sort of things we have to kind of wrestle with as a task force, and the legislature will have to going forward.
Good luck with that. Let's see. Oh, when you were talking about dredging, of course, at Cheyenne Bottoms, that's been a huge issue. Every so many years, the bottoms has to be dredged because of all the silt that's coming in. That's from the air, but predominantly, again, that's an agricultural type of issue. In the eastern part of the state, where is the silt coming from? We know where it is here, but where around those reservoirs, is that agriculture runoff?
Yeah, same sort of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the streams, all prairie streams run dirty. They're picking
Right.
up sedimentation. So
Right.
some of that's naturally coming in, some of it's runoff. It's the mix, but all the normal, the ecosystem, there's more water in it, but the ecosystems are similar in that sense.
Yeah. So is there any looking at, and I mean, as you said, it costs millions of dollars to do that dredging, and you have to do it over and over and over. Has there been research into, okay, a buffer zone of some sort because I know in the Chesapeake Bay, it's a huge problem too. And so what they're doing is they're putting the tidal flats back in. They're trying to do that to stop it. Wetlands traditionally stop silt, that type of thing. Any plans, or are you looking at plans to put a buffer around those reservoirs?
So the worst reservoirs have already been prioritized. The Division of Conservation and Department of Health and Environment, they have programs where they prioritize funding to the worst. So upstream of Tuttle Creek, for example, has been identified as a priority area. All of those programs are voluntary though, but that's where the funding will go first to try and get adoption. And there are examples. So for example, Lake Cheney had a very active watershed group. It was voluntary association, but I think it got started in the 70s, and they were very proactive in putting in best management practices upstream. And as a result, we are here 40 years later. Their sedimentation rate is the lowest, I think, of all our reservoirs in the state, because they actively and aggressively went out and did this work and understood the importance. And that just didn't happen in that organized of a way in other parts of the state. So.
And it's too late. It's already developed too much.
I mean, well, it continues. The longer we can do it, I mean, we need to keep working on it, because again, if we only have 60% of Tuttle left, assuming nothing changes, 60% is still better than 40%. So we have to, the worst case scenario is you go in, you let all the water out, you clean it out, and then you have to fill it back up. And the risk is, how long does it take to fill back up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, when they built Horse Thief out at Jetmore, they got really lucky. That thing filled up within a year or two. Some people thought it would never fill up. You look at Cedar Bluff, not a great situation. So there's always some risk involved in doing that. but there are solutions that kind of run the full spectrum from we can fix this a little bit at a time to very drastic.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question. Were you interviewed for groundwater citizenship, well owners, environmentalism, and the depletion of the High Plains aquifer by Brock Turns? Turns?
I don't think so. That doesn't ring. I'm not saying I didn't read, if that was an article or a book, I'm not saying I haven't skimmed through it, but that particular one does not ring a bell to me.
Okay. How is the amount of available groundwater in Kansas measured and checked? Is Kansas groundwater fully mapped? What percent of Kansas water is used by the beef industry? There's a lot there.
Yeah. So we have sort of two ways. There's several ways that it's measured. We have an extensive, Kansas Geological Survey has an extensive set of wells they measure every winter all over western part of the state. And they measure in the winter because that's the most reliable time. There's not this pumping stress that changes levels, but and they've tracked those declines. Well, they started that in the 80s or the 90s. So that's how they measure how much is declining. We have excellent records on use. I think by the late 90s, everybody had to have a meter and report to the state how much they use every year. So we know how much is being used. And then the Geological Survey has used, their technology has gotten better. They're now, to see how much water is available, they're doing magnetic aerial surveys now. And so they can actually use that. I mean, essentially it's like sonar, and they can map out, like, because groundwater, it's not like a big bathtub, right? It would be like if you took a region, it looks like the Flint Hills underneath there. The water, you get a little pocket here and then a steep hill, and maybe those two, like, it's technically all the same water, but they're not. If you're out of this hole over here, you're not necessarily pulling water out of the hole over there, even though we feel like it's all the same. The hydrology is much more complicated than that. So we're getting pretty sophisticated and figuring out what's underneath there. We're well ahead of a lot of other states when it comes to groundwater in that sense. Our Geological Survey has done a very good job with that.
And the third part of her question was, what percentage of Kansas water is used by the beef industry?
That was on that slide. I wanted to say, was it something like, I can go back and look here. Stock water was about 1%.
Yeah. Let me make sure I didn't lose anything or miss anything.
I've got a question. I can't put it in the chat because my computer isn't working right. But my question is, what about cities that have older pipes in rocky areas and they are losing a lot of the water naturally from the pipes, etc.? Is that a big issue with a lot of cities, or is this just a question of it goes back in the aquifer? So,
well,
deal.
I'm not the best person to fully answer that. I mean, the short answer is it depends where the water came from. If you bring your water in, if it goes 5 miles from a well up into a water tower and gets distributed, depending on where it gets lost along the way, it may or may not go back to its natural source.
Okay.
There are complexities like that would come into play there.
Okay.
But yeah, typically it's cheaper for everybody to avoid large lossage rates like that.
Okay.
Okay. Let's see.
I have a question, Am.
Oh, okay. Go, Betty.
Sorry, I'm just on my phone. But if I understood correctly, there are efforts being made to stir up the silt on the bottom of the reservoir and then pump it into or let it go into the river downstream. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's basically.
When that happens, have there been environmental studies about the effect on the stream water and the aquatic life, etc.?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's why they're doing a pilot project now. So they did the first, they did an environmental impact study, EIS or EA, probably an EA on the project when it was proposed, and then they're testing it in season. So we just did our fall one run through, and then they'll do a spring and a summer test next calendar year. And one of the things they run it for a week to 10 days is all, to see if it moves the sedimentation, and then they're measuring various things downstream. So in Tuttle, I bet it's 10 miles from the, maybe 15 miles. There's not a long stretch of the blue from the mouth of the dam down to the Kansas River.
But does it affect the oxygen content and everything else for fish?
Sure. It might, but what they have told us is that, at least their hypothesis that they're testing is, the blue is an unnaturally clear river that is sediment starved. So if you drive across Highway 24 between Manhattan and Wamego, you'll see it's a very, very deep slope where the river is eaten away at the sides of the stream bank because it's so sediment starved. And that's an unnatural state in Kansas. And so it may change the environment, but actually by putting the sediment back in there, the hypothesis is it'll actually make it friendlier for native species, and it'll be restoring something much more like the natural environment that would have been there. So, there are obviously impacts to doing that, but that's the thought process.
Thank you.
I would assume that Wildlife and Parks would be doing environmental impact studies on that.
Yeah, and the feds, they have some of their management practices and their manuals deal with wildlife seasons. So everyone's at the table on that. They're not going to authorize that big of a project. Again, that's why they're doing seasonal tests to make sure there's no unanticipated negative impacts that come from that.
Okay, let me check the chat one more time, and if there's nothing, I have one more question. If you're still available.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. No other questions. So one of the things, I was talking to my husband who is in agriculture, and we were talking about new crop options, and that didn't see, and that may be beyond the purview of your task force to look at the fact that with the changing climate and all models looking or coming to the same conclusion, we're going to become drier here in Kansas. So that water is going to be even under more pressure. Have you looked at providing funding and encouragement for agriculture to look at different crops, developing different ways of agriculture in Kansas to try and conserve water?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big question. So based on what we've seen in areas where we put in like Alima and put restrictions on, farmers typically change their practices. Maybe it's, you get a 5-year allocation, and maybe that 5th year you grow milo instead of corn, or maybe 2 years out of 5 you grow wheat, or right. So you see, mostly we've seen farmers be able to maintain their margin, but the gross numbers tend to change. But we do see changes in cropping practice. You use less water, right? So that means there's less fertilizer you put on, and sometimes it changes how much seed you put in. But they're able to make cropping practice changes with, but while still maintaining their margin of profitability. So we see that when people are forced to make reductions. Farmers are pretty adaptable. The bigger question about changing crops is it's a bigger question than the state can probably solve, because it really ties into that federal farm policy and what they're incentivizing, and we'll never offer enough money to counter those incentives. And the market isn't set up that way. You know, if you just think of the Western Kansas market, the ways we're putting that corn to use is, you know, it's corn, it's feed for the feedlots that are out there. It goes in the ethanol plants,
Right.
And then that goes up the value chain, and that's going to continue. I mean, you know, to the extent sometimes we grow the corn here, send it down to Oklahoma, and then they bring it out from the corn belt to here. I mean, it's an interesting chain, and I don't know that the incentive structure I think would have to change, and that's a total relook at federal farm policy to
Right.
get us there. I know there are people that are looking at it, and people that are experimenting, but it's a big lift.
Yeah, this is a huge issue. And there's thank yous in the chat, because we appreciate you coming and doing this so much.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what we need to do is a forum on this because it's just, wow, multifaceted. So Susan, can you think of anything else?
No, I can't.
Start.
I've learned so much from this.
Yeah, yeah.
Good.
And thanks so much for letting us record it so that people that really wanted to be here can still
Yeah, absolutely.
access it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks again. And good luck.
Thank you. Appreciate it, guys. Take
Thank
care.
you very much for doing what you're doing.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to sign off now. Thank you all for attending, and we'll see you in January.